class by turning off cell phones and other audio noise-making distractions. All right. As always, we'll begin with news of note. Last weekend had something interesting going on in the game industry. Anybody know what was going on for the game industry this past weekend? PAX East, absolutely. So as you remember, I had a lot of different news articles related to the Game Developers Conference, a lot of good information on design. You might have noticed I haven't done that as much for PAX, and I think it's important for folks to understand the difference between the big events in the industry. So here's IGN, which I like as a news source. Here is their PAX news. So I think you'll notice a difference pretty quickly on the difference between the news coming out of here and the news from GDC. News from GDC is these games have not been announced. Here's the new technology. Here are new techniques. Here's our talk about it. Whereas the news from this one is Overwatch cosplay. Cosplay gets crazy. Hands-on with Wolfenstein 2's custom Nintendo. 7 minutes of Funky Kong and Donkey Kong Country Tropical. Etc. Etc. Awesome cosplay in 60 seconds from PAX. Overwatch Mercy statue revealed at PAX. So, anyone want to hazard a guess as to why there's a significant difference in the type of news that comes out of GDC and out of PAX? Pardon? Clickbait. I don't call IGN clickbait, but some of this could come across as clickbait.
They get like most of their marketing.
Most of the marketing for PAX goes where? You're on the right course.
They're more reliant on strangers clicking their articles than they are.
No, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but you're getting there.
Well, from what you just said, I think that maybe IGN is more of a place for people who just play games too, and then game developers.
It's not just IGN. PAX itself is a consumer show. It is for players. It is for fans. There are some development focus sessions there, but the overwhelming focus of PAX is about the people who play the games. And a lot of developers go there for good reason. It's a great place to promote, a great place to talk to other people. But really, the number one reason you go there is to talk to fans. GDC, on the other hand, is very much about meeting with other professionals. You're sharing your ideas, your skills, your techniques, and that's why the hardware manufacturers want to show off their latest hardware, make big announcements, get everyone excited to come check out the latest AMD tools or whatever. And that brings up a third type, which is the E3s. So consumers are the focus of PAX, and the developers are the focus of GDC. What do you think the focus of E3 is? For the audience, though. It's not just the games who walk in and play other games. Somebody up here? Publishers are part of it, but the focus on the publishers that they're showing.
Yeah.
Media is a big part of it. They're actually twofold. Media and the retail outlets. There's still a lot of stores and online places that matter. So the fact that every GameStop wants to send their manager there is a perfect example. The fact that GameStop still exists is an important thing to keep in mind. But yes, it is the focus at E3 is not on the end consumer. It's on the person who gets the game into the end consumer's hand or gets news about the game into the end user's hands, into the person who actually spends the dollar's hands. And it's always important to know these are all very important events in our industry. They're all worth attending. But it's good to know about these different types of focus you can have when you go to these different events. All right. So a couple things have been on Gamma Sutra I think are of value to show. I just want to touch on this Q&A with Ken Ralston. Who's familiar with the name Ken Ralston? Good old Uncle Ken. Yes, exactly. And a lot of other, well, obviously, yes. Good reading the headline. Yes, Ken Ralston obviously is involved with Elder Scrolls Oblivion, Morrowind, a lot of Bethesda projects, now ZeniMax, etc. He left them a short bit ago. But he's one of the classic examples of someone who came out of the tabletop industry. He'd worked on a lot of Warhammer stuff, a lot of role-playing games, board games, etc. He'd been a fixture of the tabletop gaming community before he made the transition to the computer game industry. And yes, was rightly credited for his work on Elder Scrolls Oblivion and a lot of other very good projects. If you're interested in design, this article is good as an interview. The beauty of it again is you can just go ahead and click play and see them have a sign that says please stand by instead of anything actually happening. There we go.
Hello and welcome.
And put this on in the background while you're doing other work. Ken has a lot of keen insight. I recommend checking out. Well worth listening to what he has to say. And the best thing is he has a long and storied career in the industry and a great perspective on the industry. He has some great... how many folks are interested in RPGs, either as designers or players? Yeah, I thought that was most of the class. So I think he's been really one of the not only best designers of them, but best theorists on computer RPGs and tabletop RPGs as well. So if this is something you'd like to make or want to know more about how it's designed, I would strongly recommend listening through, looking to... He's one of the few people who can honestly say he has a philosophy of development that is actually scholarly, intelligent, and worth focusing on. So again, Gamma Sutra, check out the Ken Ralston review. Plenty of good information within here and how he comes up with what he comes up with. So one thing that I did want to share is the role of the lead designer. I know a number of you have interest in design. I thought that Ken touched on this well. On a team like Oblivion, he had a lot of people working with him. It's a huge... Who's played really any of the Morrowind, Bethesda, Oblivion-style games? Yeah. So as you know, there's a little bit of content in those games. How many hours? So you've played it a lot. How many hours do you think you logged in the game?
I'll remember because I just played yesterday. I've got 1,342.
1,342 hours. Okay.
1,500-ish.
1,500-ish. You got to catch up. You're falling behind.
I don't play
So if we got anyone claiming 2,000, that'd be a heck of an accomplishment.
maybe across all of them.
So as you know, there's a little bit of content in there. There are a lot of things happening in those games. And Ralston talks, the possibility of a lead designer knowing the content of any Elder Scrolls game is diminishingly small. Because more and more, the lead designer has to set the overall arch, the overall storyline, and then it's up to the level designers, theme designers, etc., story designers, narrative designers, to go ahead and fill in all the details. And each of them will know their own section really well, but beyond that will very likely be clueless. Certainly a lot to get into. And as he says, and which is what you really want in a game like this, you just cannot play the whole content. It's just too big to put the iterations into it. So he likes to wander through his game like a tourist, which in many ways is a wonderful form of QA. Just go in and see what you break and what's fun and so forth. And I was going to go for this analogy as well, just because I find it pretty interesting. Let's see, the role-playing game in general is the novel of the computer game class. So I guess this makes FPSs, the action story, sports games, maybe the magazine article, and I guess platformers, the limerick or something like that. But good look all the way through here, not just on designing RPGs, but RPGs are about designing in general. Recommend looking on through it. All right, now the article I want to go into the most depth on today, also from Gamma Sutra, is a look at some of the sales platforms. So a lot of you, well, a few of you, have asked about sales within the indie game community. And it's often hard to find this. One of the news items I debated talking about today is the fact that Steam has increased its privacy settings, which, while a very good thing, means we no longer know what the most popular games are. Steam Spy no longer works. We can't see who's buying what, who's playing what, and so forth. I wish that Valve itself would share those numbers, but they don't want to, and I can't particularly blame them, but we as developers and industry observers want to know what the heck is everyone playing. Is everybody in the world just playing PUBG? So, Fortnite, all right, Fortnite. So I think PUBG hit something like 35 million units sold, which is an amazing number. So I'm not sure what the average cost is for PUBG, but plenty of them. But anyway, I'm taking for granted almost all of you have a Steam account. Raise your hand if you have a Steam account. Yes, that's pretty much everybody. How many have an itch.io account? Itch.io. So a lot of indie developers are starting to go there right now. That's where I actually hosted my demo for Noble Armada. It's a little easier to get eyes on it, especially if you want independent game aficionados. Folks who really like indie games are going over to itch.io more and more. So if you want to get really good critical commentary on your game, it's a good place for it. Folks will spend some time with your game and really analyze it, show up there now. So this is a Shark Bum Studios has been in the industry for a little while in various iterations. They've released Nowhere Profit, pretty fun little game. I'll go ahead and show a little bit of their deck building game just so you can get a sense of what's going on. Showing it because it's all of a minute. All right, so looks like a pretty fun deck building game. Obviously not a AAA title, lacking the graphics, audio, and polish you'd expect of such. But by the same token, not particularly horrible by any means. So early access has been something that's been going on with Steam for a while. Who's played early access games in Steam at some point? Yeah, most of you. Good chance to try things out. Developers get good feedback on the games, begin generating a revenue stream on their games already. But early access, when it started out, was supposed to be a way to really get a lot of testing done on your game. Now a lot of companies, bigger developers, just use it as a chance to really publicize the game, more a marketing tool than a development tool. But itch.io has now offered up sort of the same platform, because the feeling now is on Steam, if you're going to early access, again, no one can see you. The big companies are just using it to market what they're up to. Doesn't really have that much meaning. So he went ahead and put up there, he's got a nice article from before about why he did it, but now he also gets to show his sales from when he's been up there. I think it's a pretty telling chart. So he says that in about 6 months he's done 10,000. Not great, but it's a look at what some indie devs do on, this isn't Steam, this is itch.io, so it's not the biggest platform. He could be potentially doing more on Steam, or maybe less. For an indie, not horrible. He's expecting, he hopes to do more when the actual selling goes. But the graph he has here is fairly telling in terms of sales. So he begins with this spike when he first launches the game. Then he gets some good YouTube reviews. And then it kind of bumps along, certain spikes. Then you have this huge spike. And this is something that I found more and more critical for indie devs. This is when he gets a really good review on Rock, Paper, Shotgun. And suddenly he has his biggest spike just pretty much off of that. And if I could break down the links, I'd love to see how many people were clicking right through that preview. And then it bumps along until he has suddenly one fan spend a whole bunch of money. That one person, this is like a one-person weird blip in his revenue. So he breaks it down into how much he makes on an average, how much he makes on his specialty days, and so forth. And by the same token, he's made $10,000, but he has a very successful YouTube channel. He's got 440,000 subscribers. Very enviable number. Total of 95,000 views. I thought those were his hours. Maybe not. Okay. And now you see his breakdown of how much he's making per his YouTube subscribers. So less than 0.2 of 1 cent for what he considered his main marketing platform, his YouTube channel, showing off his games. Getting almost nothing, he felt, for that. He got so much more off of one nice preview from Rock, Paper, Shotgun. And then he does a similar breakdown for all the Facebook likes. Oh, I'm sorry. Then he did the Rock, Paper, Shotgun Facebook likes and Twitter followers and so forth. And showing which he considers the most valuable places for him to get revenue. He breaks it down by country. It's nice. This is a nice little look. I'm not going to go into all of these various areas, but I do want to go into the some of the last places that he talks about. That in reaching out to his real high-level backers, people really supporting him, getting special rewards, he doesn't really know why that a lot of them aren't coming back to him for rewards. They're giving him the money without actually asking for the rewards to come from it. I'm seeing a little bit of this in my Kickstarter that I recently ran, where I've sent out this survey so that I can get everybody all the rewards, and I'm not getting 100% response. There are a lot of people who seems are just going to give my company $25, $100, and not want anything for it. So it's an odd bit, and as he says, I liked his comment on it. I'm a bit baffled by this, but not overly surprised, since this seems to be the case for many Kickstarters as well. One would think that this might be friends and family supporting the game, but not wanting the reward, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And that's absolutely not the case with mine. The people I know in my Kickstarter have actually told me what they wanted from it. The vast majority of the folks supported Kickstarter people I don't know, and those are the ones who aren't responding. So I'm not really sure of the reason for that. Kickstarter tells me everybody's gotten their emails and opened it, so we're not sure why. All right, now I wanted to go over this one last breakdown because I thought it was pretty interesting. Itch.io, as opposed to Steam, where you set the price as a developer. You say $4.99, $9.99, and $19.99, whatever. Itch.io, to a great degree, lets the buyers set the price. You have a base price, reward price, and tips. And I've always been amazed at the amount of money I've gotten in tips as a game developer when you set up that feature for people to do. And I think this is part of the people like to see good work, whether they get something for it or not. The whole idea of people who back Kickstarter and never ask for the rewards. So with our company, we set up our first website in the mid-90s, and we had a tip jar up there. We had a free game that we'd released in '90. Battles of Destiny, so we asked people to just give us a tip for doing that. And we would sometimes get significant tips, far more than that game cost at it when we first launched it. And he's seeing the same amount now. What I found surprising is the sheer amount of tips. So his tips are the yellow part. I mean, it's not the biggest part. Base price is the biggest. Folks who do reward bonuses next. But it's still 3% of his 10,000 is coming from tips. And so people who don't have to give him anything. I think this is something that is true within the industry, and is especially true of gamers. If they see something that they think is worthwhile, is worth supporting, they'll often just support it to keep it alive. Not because they want it. Not because they'll look at something and say, this is good, we want more of this in the world. I'm going to throw in $1, $2, whatever. Just as my way of voting that we want to see it. And I think as game developers, the more we offer our fans a chance to give this sort of input, be it, hey, send out some tweets about us, talk about us on Facebook, give a tip to show their appreciation for what's going on, the better. And I'm mentioning this in addition because there's been a lot of criticism recently about the more toxic sides of fandoms. The fans who are screaming that they hate something in a game and therefore they're going to firebomb the developer and so on and so forth. Anyone actually carrying out those acts has been essentially zero, but we certainly hear the screaming and makes people not want to go into the Twitter acid pool, as it were. But my experience is that those gamers who will actually act on what they say are invariably going to take the high road. They're going to do the positive thing, give a tip, give a positive tweet, etc., as opposed to folks who are just going to rant and rave and never do anything about it. The ranters never actually seem to do anything. So, again, for those of you who are interested in the sales side, well worth looking at. Itch.io is its own special place, well worth looking at. If you do want to launch games, it is a good way to reach out to serious indie game fans. But I also love this as just an overall look at what goes on within the industry. And he's got a nice little breakdown here about whether he hit his goals and the kind of feedback he got. This is the thing that I found surprising. He says he ended up with less of a community than he'd hoped for. This is one thing I like with my Kickstarter, that it really reactivated an old community of fans that I already had and who wanted to get back into the game. So the last thing I'll leave you with from this article, if you when you start developing games and when you start building followers who like your work and appreciate what you do, you want to support them as well, because they're definitely the ones who will find ways to support you when you need them. With my company, we had a big hiatus of releases and therefore didn't do much to support our community other than being active at conventions and Facebook and other online forums, which helped. But when you do start developing this audience, do your best to feed them, love them, keep them going with you. I mentioned Puzzles by Joe here in town. We talked again yesterday at a meeting. He's a big fan of what he calls the long tail. Every time he releases a new game, the sales of his old games pick up again. And he says it's this dedicated fan base that really makes him successful. On Sunday, I talked to another one, Robert Waller, who does the Thinker games, talking about how he's got this audience on Congregate. We'll leave Congregate and buy his games elsewhere. He's now got a fan base on Armor Games, and they're going and buying his games, and just being able to support this growing community is what's making him able to live as an independent developer. All right. So that was the last thing I want to talk about various game news that's been popping up worth talking about. From PAX, not a whole lot of incredible news, but a lot of fun videos. So worth checking those out. And let's go ahead and talk about, okay, we're at 7 o'clock. Let's go ahead and talk about Chapter 13, Narrative Design, which is a fancy word for exactly what Brathwaite and Schreiber termed this, designing a game to tell a story. So let's get a couple ideas from you. What do you think are games that had good stories? What did everybody say in the back? All right. So any of you in the back row who apparently only like Last of Us, go ahead and tell us what you liked about the story.
I like all of the themes where it continually repeated the thought that life is finite and needed to be enjoyed, and you can only act on what you believe yourself, not the greater moral of what. I just thought it was good stuff. I enjoyed it. I just enjoyed it.
So we got grand themes, we got fun in the story. You can't just say I just enjoyed it. Remember, we're trying to analyze what these are. So first of all, how did it, in the story, how did it express these themes?
The biggest thing was the prevalence of death and everything. So
There's a lot of prevalence of death in a few games.
Yes, but the point of it was that your experience in life was finite, so you had to fight and enjoy every moment of it.
Okay, so fight and enjoy every moment. Basically, carpe diem, and move forward. All right, others of you who enjoyed that story, I think it's great. We're seeing a lot of different looks at why one story can speak to different people. Someone else take a stab at what you enjoyed. Last of Us, yeah, since we had three people apparently on the same wavelength in the back row. All right, so what did you like about Last of Us? The story.
The characters, they're all they were going to use the characters of a lot of emotional, I'm not trying to word it. It knows how to get your emotions.
So create a connection to the characters, created characters you cared about, gave you reasons to care about them, gave you emotional highs and lows with those characters. All right? So great. The character development, I shouldn't say character development, the characters they created for the game. In games, generally, character development is on us as players. So let's just say the rich, deep characters. All right. So you just said you just enjoyed the story. So unpack that a little bit. What did you enjoy about the story? It was fun or I enjoyed it is never enough of an answer.
So basically, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it that much, but I guess,
Tell us about the backstory. That's not bad.
the backstory. Oh yeah, it's still a sad. Everybody's story is sad.
The girl, Sarah.
So she got burned.
Yeah, I shouldn't spoil.
Spoilers.
I don't know who That's a good point.
It's been 4 years.
I don't know if I should say it.
All right, so the pathos and tragedy.
Yeah. I mean, that helps the story move along,
All right.
and it gives the character
So you like the flow of the story.
Yes.
All right. One more, and someone else on that game, or else move on to others. Yes.
Okay, so I really like the complex that Joel had. Spoilers, obviously. In the first scene when his daughter gets shot in front of him, how he is with Ellie. It's just he's not wanting to have her represent the daughter because he doesn't want to get those feelings. It's
All right.
The whole complex where he's just not only tormented by the undead that's trying to kill him, but tormented by the daughter complex.
So the emotional tale it's telling speaks to you. It's deep for no reason. I like that. All right, let's talk about some other games with good stories. Yes.
I think, this isn't really like an obvious choice for story, but I think Shovel Knight has a good story.
Shovel Knight.
And even though it's a platformer, and platformers are known for having really shallow things going on in them, but it's how the character feels without him ever saying it.
Excellent.
Silent storytelling. And I think they pulled it off well.
Right. They did a good job of telling story through the game tools as opposed to.
Actually saying,
So one of the things I really talk about in chapter 13, but I've been a big fan of. So you've all had English class at some point. How many of you are familiar with the dictum, show, don't tell? All right. So the idea being, instead of saying that Dr. Preston's a badass, you instead show him sitting on a throne of the skulls of former students, picking his teeth with a machete or something like that.
He's the teacher that turns the chair backwards.
There you go. On the other hand, for games, we go beyond that. For us, the idea is play, then show, then tell. Sometimes we have to tell, sometimes we have to show, but the idea is we want the story to develop, just like you're talking about, through the play of the game. And I think they do that very well. In fact, one of the interesting things is most of that game's sales, I believe, are coming from Switch, which I found amazing.
Well, I thought you'd know about it because it was a huge Kickstarter success, and you're more else all about it.
But apparently it's blowing it away on Switch right now. So interesting. I really need to sit down and see how they did their Switch port. But in any case, so yes, that's the other idea we'd like to talk about in games. That the idea of why we think they can be more emotionally compelling and keep us going at it for hour after hour is because we are the one doing it. It becomes our story. And so we've talked about games that have a very clear narrative. But what about stories in a game like Madden? Or a game like Space Invaders? Is there a story in there?
Yes.
What's the story in those games?
So in Space Invaders, takes a little bit more creativity. So, but when I played it, because for Christmas one time I got one of those joysticks that had pre-loaded a bunch of games on it, which is super awesome. But Space Invaders, I always thought that they were they obviously wanted to steal our resources because they'll be that big back in their home country. But then I saw an episode of Futurama where they're basically playing Space Invaders and all the aliens wanted to do was do their laundry. That immediately trumped my idea. And now whenever I play that game, I'm just oh, they're just trying to get some laundry. They're just trying to get.
But you'll stop them anyway, so it's all right.
Yeah, so that's the story of that.
Yes. Yeah.
I've heard people talk about when they were kids and they played things like the NES or Atari, and they said that they liked having to make up their own story.
Right.
Because the one example I'm thinking of, this guy is his favorite game is The Legend of Zelda on the NES, right? And he liked that it had a little bit of story, but he was as a little kid, he liked exploring and making it his own story. He could,
Right.
figure everything out and not be told everything that's going on.
That's a very perceptive analysis. Did any of you ever play City of Heroes or City of Villains? Might be a bit before all your time before that one shut down. All right. So in City of Villains, City of Heroes, this was superhero MMOs. You would meet people who had these backstories that were pages and pages worth, thousands of words of backstory they didn't know about their character, that nobody but them was ever going to read. but they loved doing it anyway. It was all these player-created stories. And in my opinion, for a significant percentage of people who are paying to play that game, the funnest they had was sitting down and writing, which they could have done without that game existing or anything. So I've broken down game narrative into three types. One is the obvious, the very clear one that the gamer, that the company puts out there. Very obvious, this is what we're talking about. Then we have the more subtle ones where it's not spoken but it's understood, kind of like you talked about with Space Invaders. Obviously they're trying to destroy you and the Earth and their laundry all at the same time or some such. These are the ones that are much more hidden. Civilization, I think, is a classic example of this kind of game. There's a story in there. You're trying to build up a civilization. Whether you are the archetypal mind or the great spirit of that country or the one individual or the vampire king who lives on for centuries and centuries, it doesn't matter. They don't say. It's not explicit. The explicit stories are the ones they set down. It's much more implied rather than explicit. But the last and most important ones you've been talking about are those player-created ones. There's just enough story there, and then you can build your own. And in my experience, those are the stories that really matter to players more than anything else. The ones that they come up with, above and beyond anything in Metal Gear Solid, above and beyond anything in Zelda. It is what they put into it, what they project into the story while they play it, generally. It is the most meaningful part of it. So always think of that when you're designing games. It's great to have wonderful stories, but make sure there's room for the players to create their own. Yes?
I think one of the best examples of like show don't tell and a mixture of that and like player creating story is the Shadow of the Colossus trilogy, where like 3 games are linked, but they're not. Like they haven't been officially linked together.
They're linked in here, aren't they?
But people have linked all 3 games together.
And they're linked in your head as a player. I don't know a player who doesn't link them.
It's like really interesting to see how people can link all 3 of these games together and see how they all make one cohesive storyline about the same civilization over it.
Right.
I'll say another game that has sort of show don't tell kind of thing is also Undertale.
Okay, how so?
The main character does not say anything at all. You are pretty much you are expressed to your character, and any choices you make depending based on your own choice. Like you're not influenced by anything in the game. Any choice you make, like and also also goes against the normal.
All right, whoever's playing a movie against the wall. No, they were hearing odd noises. All right, so keep on. I'm sorry.
I was saying, like, unlike most games that usually, like, like this game, it doesn't require you to defeat things or kill things in order to actually, get to an end goal or story. There's actually different stories you can go into depending on whether or not you either kill things or you don't kill things.
Right.
You don't have to kill things, and so
where you can define the story along the way.
It kind of goes against most games.
Right.
In that sense, where you have to kill things. It's
Right.
kind of like very interesting twist on how usual games kind of go.
Right. Excellent. All right, we had a few more hands. You want to share one in the back?
Well, actually, I was going to say that I believe when you said like the story that players create from the gameplay, I believe I don't know if this is the technical term, but I've heard it being referred to as a ludonarrative.
So ludology is a whole interesting thing, and the ludonarrative. That is ludology is basically the science of studying game mechanics, and folks who talk about the ludology narrative are talking about the mechanics of narrative design and the mechanics, generally speaking. So I'll have to see the way you're talking about it. But yes, there's a whole academic study talking about that mechanics of how do you create the story for the story and within the story. So, and what stories do those mechanics create? What story does the game drive? Yeah. So that's been an interesting academic discipline to see develop over the past 20 years. So it is, the whole idea of lidology is well worth looking at as you get more into game design. All right, and Beck, yes.
My favorite example of what he was talking about, games linking together, is the Zelda series. How they never really link them together, but there's plenty of. So how they never put them together, but you can go through all the aspects of the games and sort of put them into a timeline. Not necessarily that they're all.
Well, let's ask you that. For those of you who played those games all the way through, do you find it more fun to make those connections in your head, or would you like them to go ahead and explain it for you?
Oh, they explained it. There's a Legend of Zelda book where timelines are.
I have not read the books.
It's overly complicated. We're like, in like
Zelda thing overly complicated.
Like,
Who would have
what
thought?
happens if Link dies in Ocarina of Time? So what happens if he succeeds in Ocarina of Time? There's like 3 branches of alternate.
Oh, I've not seen that. Have not seen that breakdown. Yes. You, yes. Yes, yes.
I can never tell. I've always thought that there wasn't the timeline, but then people started making it, and then they released one because like people were demanding it, you know.
They found a nice way to make a buck on it, I guess. And they had it internally.
Yeah.
I'm sure they had it internally. One of the secrets of game writing is write about 10 times more than you'll ever actually show in the game because you need it for the design. All right, last one.
In Dark Souls 3, the story is never told. You have no idea why you are doing almost anything you do, but if you go through and read all the item descriptions, there's like textbooks upon textbooks of story, and it explains everything, but they don't tell you about it. It's really difficult for everything to be.
All right, so yeah, a lot of different looks at different ways stories are done in game. There are a lot of ways. There's no absolutely correct way, and we're still finding neat new ways to do it. A few of the things I would always encourage for anyone looking to create story are to keep in mind the 3 things I told you about. What's explicit, what's implicit, and what do you want to have be player created. The second thing is what I told you, that you need to write 10 times more than you'll actually ever show the player. And that's a good thing. And that stuff ends up in those books that they then sell that I didn't know about. I'm sure they made a significant amount of money on as well. But the job of a game writer varies from company to company, just like what game designer means. In some companies, they're mainly focused on writing just what the narrative you'll see on screen. You'll see the dialogue, you'll see the item descriptions, encyclopedia text, etc. At other companies, they do take on part of the role of game designer, where they're writing all these character backgrounds that go to the development team, not to the fan base, not to the end users. So they're writing support materials for everyone internally. And they might write marketing copy and stuff for the box and stuff, but their main focus is creating the Bible, the full story background for the world, to make sure everyone building the game is on the same page. All this stuff, again, that no player will ever see. And then you do have those whose job is like every bit of marketing text, and somehow that marketing text ends up being in the game and so forth. They just have this, they tend to be more the marketing side even than the game side. They're writing stuff for the communities, for the websites, and also, coincidentally, some of that's going on into the game. And I find they have the least focus generally on the strength of the game, but they'll write some neat things for everyone to read and enjoy. And Brathwaite and Schreiber have a nice look at some of the main topics that we talk about in game narrative. So they talk about writer, designer, or both, which I think is an interesting look at it. There are a lot of designers who are definitely not writers. We should just be designing the game and not doing the writing. But then we have folks like Hideo Kojima, who can do both effectively. So it's well worth knowing what your strength is. So again, from the English classes you've had, you should already be aware of the three chapter story, the 3-part narrative, as it's often called. They refer to it as the 3-act story arc. So basically, you come in, everything gets introduced. They call it the inciting moment. We'll talk about it a little bit more with Campbell as the call to adventure. There's a moment where the characters get activated and have to do something. More importantly, there's a moment that happens which says these are the people you're supposed to care about and why. There's no reason to care about Luke Skywalker when he's only a moisture farmer on Tatooine. There's plenty of reason to care about him when he discovers R2-D2 and then his uncle and aunt get burnt down. Suddenly we have reason to care. That's that moment of inciting, exactly. You start learning that he wants adventure, and now what's adventure actually going to cost him? Act 2, some sort of dramatic reversal. And then Act 3, the goal and final conclusion. This has been classic in stories, fiction, no matter the language, not just English class, but all languages. But it doesn't really hold that well for games. It's great if you're going to go ahead and do a movie. But the dramatic reversal in the middle of a game is as likely to piss off a player as to drive the story forward. So you always want to be very careful about what they lose, what happens, who betrays them, etc. Far more valuable for game writing has been the hero's journey. And to a great degree, the majority of games that have a story have followed this path. And you'll see it in RPGs, FPS, platformers, everywhere. And in movies, this really is the current format for scripting. And I've heard this from folks who are very successful in the movie and TV industry, that you can't sell a movie these days that's not following the hero's journey format. It just, they realize these are the ones that sell. And we'll use Star Wars as an example for this because Star Wars, Lucas and Joseph Campbell became friends. Lucas basically admitted he was following this for creating the first Star Wars and for everything he did from then on using this format. Campbell's a very interesting figure. Before he comes around, the way mythology is studied is here's the differences between all these mythologies all over the world. Here's what happens in Greek mythology versus Norse mythology versus African mythology. You have a question?
Oh, no.
Just waving your hand?
I'm sorry.
All right. With Campbell, and there are others as well, but mainly with Campbell, you start having the study of what's common between the world's myths, whether it happened in Australia, Africa, China, Alaska, wherever, there are commonalities. And one that he pulled out, and really the core of his studies, was the hero's journey, that all cultures have hero stories that follow this. And this book lists it as 5 parts. I've seen it broken down into like 20-some parts. Campbell never specifically said as a step-by-step, this is exactly what happens. He says there are these common elements. But one that is very true to it is that call to adventure, that moment to incite. So in the RPG, or in a role-playing game, the parents get killed, the daughter gets killed, the home village gets burned down. Something happens where the lead player cannot go back to that player's original life. Half-Life, we've got demons starting to tear up the labs, whatever. Something happens where you have been somebody in your ordinary life, and now you cannot go back to that ordinary life. You have to go forward. There's no just stepping back. Then they go through a series of challenges. This is the core of games. Step by step, interact with an obstacle, overcome that obstacle, generally get a reward. And this is what Campbell talks about in mythology. You'll see in the myth of Hercules, him overgoing his number of specific trials that he was given. And out of one of them, he gets an impenetrable lion hide that he wears as armor, for instance. He gets other items or friends who are the benefits thereof. You find this again in the spider mythologies in Africa, the raven stories in Native American cultures, and so forth. Then they confront the final evil, whatever the biggest enemy is. They kill the Medusa. Hercules faces finally his final trial. Another classic example is with bringing fire to earth. We find they steal fire away from the gods themselves. A great obstacle is the gods themselves, and they bring back fire, which is step 4. They return to the everyday world and bring something with them, something that they have learned. And often, one of the things that isn't touched on here is this whole idea that there's an underworld aspect of it, that there is at some point when they go into a non-terrestrial world, some place is very different, astral plane, the underworld, whatever, Odysseus traveling the underworld, and come back with a gift from having dealt with that. So in Star Wars, Luke gets a very literal call to adventure in the form of R2-D2 with the Princess Leia. I'm not talking about Star Wars. I'm talking about the real Star Wars, not Jar Jar. I'm talking real Star Wars. You get the original call to adventure, the image of Princess Leia calling him out. Then the door closes when his uncle and aunt are burned. At that point, he can't go back to his old life and can only move forward. You get a very serious road of trials. Lucas did the whole underworld sequence essentially as the bar sequence in Star Wars with all the Tsar aliens and the band playing. That's his equivalent of the underworld that Luke has to go into and come out finally understanding what a Jedi is when he sees Luke cut off somebody's hand and he understands the force of what he is dealing with. You've got this whole series of continuing encounters that he has to do. Each one of them generally comes with a reward, new friends like Han Solo, and new equipment, and they move on till finally they have to confront the great enemy, which is both the Death Star and, of course, the final confrontation with Darth Vader. So they blow up the Death Star. Han Solo comes to his aid in the nick of time, sends Darth Vader spiraling off, spoiler alert, and then they come back with the reward, for not just themselves, but for all of humanity. Anyone have an idea what the final reward is?
Fancy gold medal. And
They get the fancy gold medal, but what they bring back with them is actually the name of the movie. Anyone remember the name of the A New Hope? A New Hope. Star Wars, A New Hope. Yes, they bring a Star Wars back for all humanity to enjoy. Nothing better. Yes, they bring back a new hope for everyone who didn't have hope at that point. So it's the whole idea, again, the whole Pandora opening the box, and what's left at the bottom is hope, which some people think is a curse of itself, but in the end, that's the final gift, the final prize. And so again, you can see how this applies to so many games you've played over the years, especially RPGs and FPS, but platformers and others as well. And understanding this gives you a very easy framework to follow. If you want to dig into the Campbell stuff, let's definitely do. I personally like The Hero with 1,000 Faces, but there are a lot of commentaries that have been written on it that are very good. And in fact, a number of years ago, we had the head of the Joseph Campbell Society come to Siege here in Atlanta and speak about the hero's journey in games. And it's a very penetrating discussion. So you can find that up on our YouTube site as well. So lots of good elements within here. Oh, the ludology. It's the next section. I'd forgotten that ludology was the very next section. So I tell you what, before we get into narratology and ludology, we're at 7:24. Let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back on in. So I go from a discussion of the hero's journey to discussion of the game journey, because in many ways the game journey is a perfect example of Campbell's hero's journey done without any words at all. So someone who's played the game journey, can you talk about what that experience is? What you do in the game journey? This has nothing to do with the band, just make sure you all understand that. Did anyone? I thought someone in the back played Journey. But what are you actually doing? I mean, it's very simple. What are you doing? You're walking in a desert. You're walking around in a desert, and there might be another player in there. And you can't communicate with that player. You can't talk to that player, I should say. Players have found very innovative ways to communicate with each other. But it's very much a classic example. You start with the point you can't go back. You're suddenly in the desert. There's nothing else you can do but journey through the desert. You can't go back home. You have to overcome these puzzles along the way. When you reach the end, the journey ends, and what have you developed? Generally, you've developed a friend. The person who you played this with, you could not communicate with the whole time. You don't know who it was. You don't set up like I'm going to play with somebody I know. You would go in, and some other player would be in the same game with you, who happened to log in at the same time. So it was a fascinating example of how to build up a story. And you created a story through solving puzzles and communicating with this other person without there being any words in the game at all. So it's a classic example. Here are mechanics that are created to drive you to create a player's story. I've heard arguments also that the sports games are some of the perfect examples for this. You have the whole Madden game, but it's really I am the quarterback throwing the ball, or I am the receiver catching the ball. All you can do is create a story out of it. You create a story out of it with yourself in the first person role. So we're not going to go in depth on narratology and ludology. These are good disciplines for studying games. They're done more on the academic level than in the professional arena, which is why I think Brathwaite and Schreiber only devoted a few paragraphs to them in this entire book, whereas there are whole massive publications on the topic at this point. But what I do like is that people are talking about narratology, which is games as a storytelling medium. What are the stories we can tell that are different and in a different way? And I think that's in a lot of ways how games do their best work. So Brathwaite and Schreiber have a nice little breakdown of the different types of stories you'll find in games. Linear stories, Half-Life is a classic example. You're on rails, everything goes straight through this story. Everyone who plays it experiences the same story. And it's just how well they experience the story that matters. The branching stories, I've talked before about the problem with creating too many branches in your stories, that you have to create incredible amounts of content as it grows at an exponential rate. So you have to find ways to keep from getting hit by your own branches. But this does give you a lot of different things you can do. The open-ended stories, they talk about Elder Scrolls. If you want to read the Ralston description of how they did what they did, you've got that Gamma Sutra article to look at. And if you did like really any of the ZeniMax Bethesda games, it's well worth checking out a more in-depth look at how they created their stories. Then about instances, emergent, thematic, and algorithmic. I think those are getting a little more specialized, but they're worth knowing about. And then we get into the methodology for telling stories. And I think this is important to go into a little more depth on. Brathwaite and Schreiber talk about a few of the main ways. Cutscenes and cinematics. What's a game with really good cutscenes that really drove you to want to play that game more? Metal Gear is probably the greatest example. He came out of wanting to he came out of that cinematic background, wanted to create movies, and created games as movies. Did a beautiful job of it. What's a game that uses in-game events well to drive the story? I think a few have already been named.
Metal Gear.
Call of Duty series.
Call of Duty. Yeah. I think that a lot of the Clancy games have tried to do this along the way. A lot of the Ubisoft Tom Clancy games. What's a game with good dialogue to drive story forward? Anyone ever played Monkey Island? Metal Gear, yeah, exactly. Anyone ever played Monkey Island? Mario dialogue, yeah, that classic Mario dialogue. Which is... Sorry, were there some actual serious answers to the question of games with good dialogue?
Metal Gear.
We already got that one. No one ever played Leisure Suit Larry or Monkey Island? Those games really are essentially dialogue masquerading as games, jokes masquerading as games. I would argue to a degree that you don't know Jack, which is now alive. Oh, what is it now? Yeah, the Party Pack, exactly. To a degree, is all about good dialogue, which I've seen people create their own stories along the way, generally of being abused by the game designers, but by the same token, having that role. And just all sorts of other text. They specifically mentioned in-game descriptive messages, notes, books, etchings on the wall, items in Dark Souls 3. Great example thereof. I'm a big fan, actually, of game encyclopedia text. I've incorporated in my games. I like reading through the encyclopedias of the game at my own leisure and finding neat hints and neat information about the world that way. I think most of the MMOs did really good jobs at that. read on through. The quest dialogues would often do the same, read back through your quests and so forth. Anyone think of any other ways that you can tell a story in a game in an interesting way? Yes? Okay, what did they do? That's true. That's true. Right, I said lots of good gameplay in that one. Any other ideas? Yeah, through the specific gameplay you were doing, you were seeing the story. Yes?
Rumor tells story to the characters that the player controls. They have certain character attributes and they'll interact with one another depending on it. So, like the game is you kind of control like some colonists on an alien world, and so depending on their personalities, like colonists can get married, and so they'll get like happy next to each other. Colonists will even like fight each other if they dislike each other. So there's like statistics, I guess you could say, for
right.
the story.
I've also seen people talk about telling stories through emojis, hearing about the happy and sad. Just little emoticons and emojis popping up in games to tell the stories. Music has been surprisingly underused for storytelling, but it has been used. The Lord of the Rings online game used music quite a bit as a storytelling motif. So you can keep a ear out for that within games as well. So, yeah, a lot of different ways that we can push the story along in games that other media don't really have access to. I mean, we love it in the Avengers movies and we see hidden things throughout, but those are really only Easter eggs to color it. They're not really driving the story to a significant degree. They talk a little about the tell, show, do. I really prefer to say play over do because there are a lot. Do takes the fun out of it in my mind. What you're doing in GTA is you're playing. You're not just doing. You're accomplishing. You're having fun. And do really sounds like a task to me, as opposed to you've been assigned to do your game, not that you want to make your game. You're having a chance to play it being a game designer along the way. They have a nice little breakdown. We've already talked about the importance of characters, good characters. They talk about the environment design. Again, this is one where Lord of the Rings Online really shone. They had all this great Tolkien world, and then they just ran with it and built on it and made it beautiful. And so many of the folks who enjoyed when the Tolkien movies came out just loved the LOTR game for really expanding on what they wanted to do. The last thing I wanted to talk about is what Schreiber and Brathwaite talk about, choosing mechanics to match the story. Some designers do this. They think specifically, here's my story, how am I going to best build it up? I see it often work in reverse. Here are our mechanics. What kind of story can we do well with what we have in front of us? To a degree, I think that the Tiburon Madden team did a bit of this when they started creating their story modes. They're saying, hey, wait, we've got all these tools we've done to create a great sports game. How do we tell a story using these tools? And they started doing, not the franchise mode, I'm trying to think of the name of their long shot, right, I was trying to think of underdog, right, long shot mode to follow the story of you as a character within it. Because they already had all these great tools, now just tie it all together to make a story that was even more riveting that was already there in place. So they have a nice example. I'm probably going to use a different example. She talks about the book, The Grapes of Wrath. Who's read any Steinbeck, much less Grapes of Wrath? All right, I got a few people who have. Excellent. All right. So yeah, we're talking about extreme poverty. We're talking about the Depression era in America, Great Disruption. Not going to go into the story too much for folks who haven't read it. It's a wonderful story. But then they talk about you could make this into an adventure game, an action game, an RPG, an educational game, or a tycoon game, my old background, as you try and get out of extreme poverty. I've had some friends like to throw around, what would they do if they had the Game of Thrones license? What sort of game would they make? So let's throw that out to you right now. If you had the Game of Thrones license, what kind of game would you make?
Hey, that was
Where everybody dies. I don't want to know who you've been dating.
It's maybe like a game like Crusader Kings or EU.
Crusader Kings, so a nice combat game with a story.
probably like Shadow of Mordor.
Shadow of Mordor, so something with strong RPG elements. My initial reaction is a strategy game. I want to do a huge fantasy civilization style, build up your community's battle game. By the same token, I want to be on the side of winter and build up those forces as well. I want to be able to play the bad guys in it. I've had other friends talk about the Wolf Simulator. Yes.
There was actually a mod that was created with the Total War series game.
A mod for Total War?
Yeah, they created a Middle Earth Total War mod.
Middle Earth Total War? Excellent. Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, I remember playing a Civilization Civ 2 Tolkien mod way back when. That was probably early 90s or some such. But yeah, there've been some, obviously fan mods are always going to be wonderful fun. I've liked the idea of the going on the topic from before of adventure games. I also like the idea of the wolf platformer, riding your wolf to accomplish certain tasks. So the idea is if you have a story, there's all sorts of different games you can use to make it. What sort of mechanics will match the story? It really matters what kind of story you want to tell and what mechanics you have to utilize. If you've been doing platformers and want to keep doing platformers, you can do a Game of Thrones platformer. Now, there'd be a lot of fans who might be ticked off at it because they feel you're making light of some pretty deep subject matter, but I think it can be done really well and with and honoring the content that already exists. So it's a fun idea to take, is to look at a license, look at a story that you like, and see what kind of game you could make out of it. I talked about Bible Fight from Adult Swim games. I mean, there have been all sorts of religious games. The idea that you could do a fighting game based on the Bible is not the first one that comes to mind, but in the end makes a certain amount of sense. So I agree with Brathwaite and Schreiber in a lot of this, but I also think that if you have good mechanics, you can attach a good story to it and have them cooperate very well together. So if you have something you do well and you want to tell some other kind of story with a little bit of creativity, you can do that. All right. Any questions on chapter 13? All right. Let's go ahead and jump on into quiz 10. Now we've already talked about some of the answers in here. So quiz 10. A game writer and a game designer are two distinctly different jobs that require two different skill sets. True or false? Yeah, we talked about that a bit before. There are many designers who are not good writers, which is sad because communication is one of their main roles. So the three-part story arc follows this path. A, setup, confrontation, resolution. B, beginning, middle, end. C, confrontation, battle, winner declared. C, call to adventure, application of lesson, resolution. Setup, confrontation, resolution. And they talked about there being a twist as a part of that. That's classic in movies, but not as classic in games. All right. What was asserted in Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces? A, hero myths in many cultures follow similar patterns. B, Aristotle's three-part arc is flawed. C, the five-part arc is an alternative to the three-part arc. 4, the hero receives a call to adventure. Or 5, both A and C. Both A and C, because they talk about it as a five-part arc. Certainly what Campbell talked about is there's more than just a three-part arc in it. And the hero myths in many cultures follow a similar pattern. The study of games as rules is known as A, lexicology, B, ludology, C, lithology, or D, liturgiology. Ludology, yes. This is the study of games as a storytelling medium. A, nematology, B, narratology, C, nomology, or D, numerology. Narratology, yes, definitely not numerology. These are movies that set up or continue the narrative of the game, but can occur outside of the game's engine. Cutscenes, yes, other options were cistern, setup, etc. These refer to scripted events that occur within the game using the game's engine in order to set up a scene or otherwise advance the story's narrative. A cistern, B cinematics, C cutscenes, or D narratology. Cinematics, yes, using your game engine cinematically. Any story points to one and only one clearly defined and appropriate genre. True or false? Absolutely. Lots of different ways to take a story. Games and stories are similar in that they derive their emotional power from uncertainty of outcome. True or false? Yeah, the problem, we know exactly what's going to happen. Why bother playing it at all? Stories and games achieve their emotional power through uncertainty of outcome in exactly opposite fashions. True or false? True. With the stories, it's us reading to the end. The other, it's us playing to the end, feeling it, experiencing it. Creating effective pacing in a game can be likened to musical composition. True or false? Yeah, I love that look of the game's tempo. We're going to go into that in some detail. Impetus to move can be created by A, following an NPC, B, time limit, C, presenting objectives, D, create architectural pressures, or E, all the above. Exactly. Perception of danger creates tension in a game. True or false? Yeah, when you're afraid of that headshot, you are skulking and sneaking around everywhere. What does the Metal Gear Solid 2 design document say players will spend 80% of their time doing? Playing hide and seek, killing foes, shopping, or engaging in trade wars. All right. So, all did pretty well on that. Let's go ahead. I'm sorry that for some reason they recently changed the permissions on one of the reading assignments I'd given you. So we won't go into that one today, but we will examine game pacing. So I think there's a really nice breakdown of a lot of tools you as a designer can use. So Davies talks about a number of key aspects of game pace, movement impetus, the will of the player to move through the level. One thing you always want to do when you're a designer is think character and player as two different things, or avatar and player as two different things. Make sure you always keep them distinct. What the player is doing is very different than what the character is doing. The character may be being shot at, jumping from platform to platform, throwing hand grenades. The player is sitting at a desk or on a couch using a controller or keyboard. So it's important to keep these separate. So the character really has no will to move unless you're doing an endless runner game. In any other kind of game, really, the character is just going to sit there unless the player wants the character to move. So threat, the notion of danger, tension, and tempo, the level of actual action currently being experienced by the player. And I think tempo is very good. You'll see in sports games, especially in a back and forth game, you have this bop, bop, ping pong, tennis style of tension, of tempo. But in other games, you'll find very distinctly different tempos along the way. I like that Davies breaks down all these different ways to drive the player to move. There's no reason for the player to make that character move at all except what you give them to do. Exploration is a big one. I want to go ahead and look around, see what's there, but that only lasts so long. So threat from behind, present an objective ahead, impose a time limit, narrow physical options, draw their eye to someone. Lighting is such a powerful tool for level designers. The area that's light is where the player is going to go. Different colors have different meanings, and players learn them. Architectural pressure, weird things in the environment, snatch desired object, take things away from a player, an NPC leading the way, and so forth. And then there are reasons why the player will go ahead and stop moving the character around. These wow moments, something fascinating has happened. There's an obstacle. Some altered kind of movement has come along. There's a threat ahead that they have to gauge, some increase in tension. They've got too many routes to choose. An NPC halts the player, maybe with a quest. Taking stock of inventory. They've picked something up, now they've got to put them together and do something with it. There's some dialogue. There's some story exposition. There's even a cinematic hopping along. And as we talk about tempo, there are reasons for the players to stop and reasons for the player to go. Even in a platformer like Mario, you stop at certain times to gauge the environment, figure out what's going on, and then you move forward. Even in Sonic, you spend time stopped, not moving forward. And we as designers have to understand that unless you're doing an endless runner, there are times when the players want to sit and figure out what they need to do next. So he breaks down these into a lot more detail. But the section I find most valuable and perhaps the least obvious to new designers is the idea of tempo, the level of intensity of action, how much concentration they're requiring. Also, I like to think of this also as the speed at which the player has to think. We talk about the microsecond decisions players have to make and the number of decisions they're having to make each second. For me, that's what tempo is. How many decisions am I as a player having to determine and enact along the way? So sometimes it's like this, and other times it's that or faster. And that's the tempo for me as a player. And as a designer, I want to think about that. What tempo do I want my players to be at? Yes? What's the difference between tempo and pacing? In my mind, pacing is what the game applies on the player, and tempo is how the player reacts to that. Am I as a player going like this? Am I as a player going like this? The pacing, so an endless runner, the game sets a pacing, and that's what you're at the entire time. I can't really modify that as a player. On the other hand, in an RPG, there might be a dozen enemies coming at me. The game is setting up this frantic pace, and I might go into inventory to pull out something better to do.
Or could you say that pacing is like if the entire, like when you start playing a game at the beginning, you don't know what to do and like nothing's going on? Would that be like?
I think that's a great. So the pacing in a tutorial scenario is going to be a lot slower than the pacing in an end game scenario.
And what would be like bad pacing?
Throwing a million things at a player when they're just starting the game or giving them nothing to do late in game. Not having enough to do late in game and getting bored. It's the whole idea, again, the whole game progression curve. Getting frustrated because it's too difficult or getting bored because it's not difficult enough. So we as the designers can set the pace to a certain degree, but the player sets the tempo. What tempo do we want them to run at? We want to encourage them to have a tempo that's in keeping with the pace that we're setting as designers. So I think that's a pretty good question, a pretty good look at how the two apply to each other. And I love these little pseudo bell curves. So you've got the tempo over time, the turning point in a combat, classic in RPGs. There's this point which you know you've won generally. Except in the boss fight, where you don't know until the very end that you're going to win, that you get down to your last hit point, your last points of mana, and then the enemy falls or you fall. I like that idea, the crescendo feel. Right, so here's the structure of pacing. So this is all sort of how it's applied to the player. So you've got the musical rhythm. These are the things that the designer can set to a great degree. And I really enjoy this breakdown of the musical tie-ins to it. How the flow is like the melody of a game. How many people in here are actually musicians? I know we have some folks interested in game audio. So when you look at these, I hope these are, for the most part, terms that you're familiar with. Monotone is certainly something we are all familiar with. So I try to speak in a monotone. But I like the idea the timing of events that determines game pace. Again, the designer throwing out events, and this determines the pace of the game, and then the player reacts with their tempo. I like this breakdown. If you come out of a musical background, I think they apply, but if you don't, I think they come together pretty well. And there was this nice breakdown of Call of Duty, how it all applies, how you start at the very beginning and work it on through. And I've done something like this with Noble Armada. I've looked at some of the scenarios I've done and seen how quickly players will be engulfed in craziness. I tend to get you in there very quickly. But I like how they set it up. So you start off with a low threat, medium tension, high impetus to move to make something happen, and an average tempo. And that begins to change over time. And you can track this flow. I'm not going to go through the whole breakdown of what Davey sets up in here. But it's a pretty nice look at it. It's not always easy to do this, but it's something that can be done. I'm kind of amused that the end fights are medium, 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 average, and so on. That it's not all very high, very high, very high, really at much of any point. They all mix together very well to form an actual symphony in a sense. So I think that Davies has done one of the best breakdowns of how to determine tempo and pacing in a game. It's an important thing. We as players, again, don't want to be bored. We want things to be happening and reason to have things happening. But for most designers, I think the most valuable part of this discussion will be at the very start, where he talks about these various elements you can use to drive the player forward and get things happening. So a nice little set of tools to put in your kit for making games later on. All right, any questions about the Davies game pacing? All right, Metal Gear Solid. So none of you are apparently familiar with this game, right? What do I need to know about Metal Gear Solid?
Okay, so Metal Gear, is that 3?
Yes, this is 3.
So why does it say 2 at the top? Which one is it? 3.
Oh.
They tell you about
MGS2 one might expect we are making MGS3.
Yep.
What? You got.
There you go.
I said 3 not 2. Get ready.
There you go.
Coaching much is
There you go. It's the second one called 3.
Ah, of course. Okay, so Twin Snakes. Twin Snakes is basically the plot for Escape from New York.
And you have a character even named Snake in here.
No. It's not for long.
All right. So the reason I signed this design document at the same time, it's not really a full design document. As they say, it's a grand game plan as opposed to a design doc. This is the overall look at what they want to accomplish along the way. I like the fact that they talk specifically about platforms and regions where they're releasing it. They talk about their development schedule along the line, but then the actual goal of what they're trying to do. Again, they start with, here's what we want to accomplish, really big picture, and then they start getting into the specifics and minutia of how they're going to accomplish that. So what do they see in other sequels? They see a lot of things being carried over from other games, and they list some pros and cons with this. Whether or not you agree with their analysis, doing this sort of breakdown of what other games in your field are doing, what you could accomplish, is invaluable. And it's very interesting to see them right at the very beginning. Metal Gear Solid 2 will aim to be an orthodox sequel. We'll carry over the entirely same world, characters, game system, and story seen in the previous game, interweaving all these components while helping new players into the game. In a sense, we'll go for a true type of sequel not found in other games. So, Metal Gear Solid fans, did you enjoy 2? So I don't know any Metal Gear Solid fans who didn't enjoy 2. I think that's a pretty safe.
Wait, is Metal Gear... Okay, so this isn't Metal Gear 2, it's Metal Gear Solid. So it's... Okay.
No, not that he likes to confuse, not that he ever likes to confuse everybody, but he likes to confuse everybody.
Well, I mean, because I know Metal Gear was originally like an 8-bit game, or like a 16-bit game.
Right. Metal Gear Solid, you're right. We don't refer to anything except for Metal Gear Solid anymore. So he talks about being a classic, orthodox sequel as opposed to trying to do something really weird. Anyone want to take a guess as to why he's talking about being an orthodox sequel as opposed to being something different? He doesn't really say specifically, but it's very clear that they thought they'd succeeded with the first Metal Gear Solid. They thought they'd built up a very loyal fan base right off the bat. And I've always thought that this is something they just wanted to be true to their original fans. They didn't want to do something that would pull the rug out from under their fans and give them something completely different to try and get used to and lose those fans. What they were hearing from their fans was the fans wanted more of the same. So they gave them that in a much better package. Stealth remains key. They talk about how to bring new players in. For a sequel, that's something I haven't really seen done that often. Often there are a number of years between an original game and a sequel, So it's not uncommon for development studios to look at them as completely different games. I mean, the players, yeah, they played it 2 years ago, but are they going to still want to play the same game? On the other hand, they're saying, here's how we bring the old players in, place emphasis on the improved quality over the previous game, and then how do you bring in the new players, convey it all in easy to understand terms, and with new characters in the new environment. And then I'm not really sure what they mean by independent adults. I guess that means singles in their early 20s or something. You know, the people who will have the time to really play a Metal Gear Solid. But it's clear they're looking at an audience. I'm not sure what a Japanese middle school audience would be, but I'm thinking he's thinking male 16 to 24 or his core demographic here. If they were to break it down in our more traditional terms. And it's interesting that they talk about characteristics of an orthodox sequel. What makes it an orthodox sequel is, I suppose, something different. The mechanics are very similar. The characters return. The story is a direct continuation, not just using the same universe again. And moving forward accordingly. And then they talk about how it differs from the other game's cinematic titles. And this was the interesting one. We will not pursue cinematic visuals. We will pursue a realistic world and use the hardware's capabilities to create a realistic reality. So it really was the stage in which they were saying we could use a game engine and the art we make in-game to be cinematically comparative, to be movie quality. So again, for those of you who played this, what did you think of the art at the time? Just it was Snake, so it didn't really matter? It wasn't Snake, so it didn't matter. So yeah, for a lot of people, the look of this game was one of the first times people felt that games could really be movie quality within the game itself. And folks have just driven to do that more and more over the years. And that's, I think, the focus for them on create realistic enemies and realistic environments. Because now we can make them look really good. It's very funny that bodies that do not disappear was a major competitive thing that they wanted to put in at this time. Why do bodies disappear in games? Memory! Everything on the screen eats up memory. Let's get rid of the stuff that don't matter. That's why a slaughter field will look so nice and pretty at the end.
So the more you kill, the better the game is.
Yeah, the more things you get off the screen, the faster you can run the game.
Yep.
Once you wipe out the horde, you don't need to be fast, but then you are. All right. It's very interesting seeing what mattered at the time, the height, the level of depth that we now take for granted within these. And then we have this interesting breakdown on all the different themes and concepts. And we were talking about concepts in other games. And if you are trying to tell a story with your game, it's very important to know what the story is. What is the theme that we're talking about? So we already talked about the fragility of existence, the need to seize the day, to enjoy what we have as a theme of a game. Pretty good theme for a game to have. Can anyone think of other themes that games have had that they tried to get across? Civilization. Does the continuing arc of civilization, the tie from the first of humanity to the ones who exist today, the ongoing story of a culture, the fact that what happens thousands of years ago still has impact on us today. We don't think of it having a story theme, but it very much does. Anyone else want to take a look at a game you think has a theme that you can describe? Go ahead.
I'd say Spec Ops The Line, but I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't played it yet because it's time. Someone else who hasn't played it yet.
Telling what the theme is would spoil it?
But, yeah.
Okay. All right. Yes, in the back. I'm sorry, no, one of those students talking, be quiet. Yes.
Years Edge had a very political message. The whole individual freedoms are more important than safety.
Okay. Individual freedom is more important than safety. All right.
Every Fallout game has the same theme of that war never changes.
What did you call the theme for Fallout?
War never changes. It's set in like the beginning and end of it.
War, the destructiveness of war is a definite theme of the Fallout games. But one of the interesting aspects of Fallout, a lot of games try to have this as a theme, but Fallout does it very well. The ability of one individual to make a difference has been an ongoing focus of the Fallout team going back to the Interplay days. And we like to think that in most games that's the case, but they really do it effectively in a way that I think a lot of players take that message home, that a player, one individual can have a great impact on building things back up or tearing them down some more, making things better or worse. Let's see, who's battled Big Daddies at some point in their gaming career? Anyone want to take a guess at a theme for that game? What are you willing to sacrifice? Is a good example of that one. What are you willing to give up? Well, it's interesting. Then, what is a theme? That's something maybe we should have discussed in more depth. What is a theme?
It's the story. It's like the moral you want to say.
Moral is a way to look at it, but a moral is often a very specific lesson. For instance, freedom is more important than security. That's a very specific lesson. Others, it's a overarching feeling they want you to take away from it, something to experience along the way. So what is the overarching experience that they want you to have within this game? And again, in games where it is all play, where it is all experience, it is more important that we leave a player with a feeling. What's the dominant feeling we want a player to have? There are games where depression is the ultimate feeling they want you to have, because the game is frankly sad. Exultation is a very common one within gaming. But if we want people to think in more depth, things like the ability of one individual to make a difference becomes important thematically. So the themes here, what do we leave to our children, to the future generations? What do we leave to the rest of humanity along the way? Social themes, the digitization of the military, the digital battlefield. So in this, they're not really teaching a lesson. They're trying to let you experience something and see, what does this mean to us as people? And I love this little breakdown, the aim of the story. A series of betrayals and sudden reversals to the point where the player, not just the character, but the player is unable to tell fact from fiction. Extremely difficult to implement in an action game, but we are aiming for the type of development and structure seen in the film LA Confidential. Our intention with the previous game was to have a very clear and understandable story, but this time we will aim for an entertaining story with a lot of foreshadowing. Every character lies to or betrays someone once. It's a heck of a world. A series of spy versus spy and betrayal, the game iteration of LA Confidential. Fact versus fiction. Not everything your eyes tell you is the truth. What is real? What is fantasy? Other games have done this to a great degree. Max Payne was mentioned in the readings. Dug into this a good bit, to some extent even the Punisher games. In what we ironies aimed at the digital society and gaming culture. So you as designers, it's fun to be able to think of, what do you want the players to take away? Are there lessons you want them to take away? Is there a feeling you want them to experience? What matters to you? And then how do you implement it and ensure that actually happens at game's end? All right, and the last thing I really wanted to go into, there's a fair amount to this document. There are all these nice little breakdowns of the different adventure settings, what all happens within the game, and so forth, and this nice little world background. And surprisingly enough, a rogue state is suspected of developing a nuclear weapon. I mean, a Metal Gear. U.S. airstrikes are imminent. So, yeah. No Snake here in the world today, but the same story lives on well over a decade later. So you can take that as the end of the theme of the design document itself. All right. Did anyone have any other questions about the Metal Gear Solid doc? A lot of good stuff. Again, most of the rest of it is specific breakdowns of scenes and like, but well worth digging into. All right. A number of you have or a few of you have expressed interest in having a day to work. We've got a little less than an hour left in class for you to work on your games and your design documents. So if you want to, you can go ahead and do that. You're not going to get a twist thrown at you today. I know some of you have been expecting it. The twist for today is that there is no twist for today. So. So if you want, you can take the rest of the class. We have, like I said, less than an hour. Go ahead and get to work on your games and your design docs.